Hello everybody, this is Johns Hopkins with Baltimore Heritage, and we're back with another of our 5-minute history videos. And today I'm out on York Road, and behind me is the Timonium Fairground. If you're following along real time, more or less, you know we're heading into the State Fair, the end of August, early September. It almost for sure will be hot, but there is so much going on, it is irresistible. Where else can you watch a horse race or a pig race? Where else can you see a concert or a strolling piano? And where else can you get something called a crab and cheese stuffed pretzel roll washed down with something called a chocolate dipped strawberry iced tea? It is all fabulous, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, the first state fair was not in Maryland. It was in New York, in Syracuse in 1841. It's been there every year ever since. Our state fair didn't get started quite as early. It has its roots back in the 1880s with a kind of unusual story. A gentleman named Grafton Marsh Bosley in 1878 hosted an event on his property just north of Timonium. He was a doctor and he was raising money to help patients who had yellow fever. It was pretty popular, and the next year, 1879, a group of folks formed what was called the Agricultural Society of Baltimore County, and they leased 37 acres of property here at what was called the Timonium Estate. As a somewhat aside, Timonium got its name from a woman named Mrs. Archibald Buchanan. She, in her later years, was really sad. She had lost a lifelong friend and was losing her eyesight. So she decided to name her estate after an estate in classical literature. And that was one of a Roman general and the lover of Cleopatra, Mark Antony. He had an estate on the island of Antirodos, I hope I'm saying that right, outside of Alexandria, Egypt. And in a precursor to Romeo and Juliet, he committed suicide there on the false news that Cleopatra had priorly also committed suicide. So Timonium has somewhat of a sad origin story, but the name stuck. All right, back to the state fair. The Agricultural Society's first state fair was in 1879. It was not the first state fair or the only fair going on at that time. In 1870, the Maryland State Fair was in Frederick. Just around the corner at that same time, there was a state fair in Lutherville. And to make matters more interesting, at about that same time, the folks at Pimlico were running a fair that they claimed was the state fair. Having two state fairs was not tenuous, and eventually in 1906, the two merged, ending up choosing this place as its headquarters. And it's been here going strong ever since, with two little hiccups. One was during World War II. For several years, the Army occupied this site as a depot and vehicle maintenance yard. The second was in the 1950s when the Maryland Jockey Club, which was the controlling stakeholder in the business, decided it wanted to sell the fairgrounds for an industrial park. People rose up, all sorts of people, bankers and farmers and business people. They raised $600,000. They formed a group called the Save the Maryland State Fair Committee. They purchased the property and said that it would be the state fair indefinitely. So now that we've gotten ourselves safely into an annual state fair, what's gone on over the years here? Well, the early years, the fair was largely intense, but it had the same key ingredients, I think, that the state fairs today have. The first of those was exhibits. It had farm and garden products. It had home arts like sewing and cooking, and it had livestock of sort of every imaginable animal on a farm. It had competitions. Back then, the competitions were the ox pull and plowing. And it had food. Back then, it was largely the wives of farmers who made homemade sandwiches, and they were the concessionaires. And finally, it had amusement, maybe not as thrilling as today's Riptide roller coaster, but back then they had sack races and grease pole climbing. By 1916, things started to change a little bit. The star attraction then was an exhibit on canned foods and another one on the still new automobile. It was hot, like always, and like always, there were medics on site to help out, although these medics came from the Red Cross back then. By 1929, there were still the typical exhibits of cows and horses and whatnot, but new to the state fair that year were exhibits by the Maryland State Normal School, which had moved to Towson in 1915. Of course, today that's Towson State University. In 1942, a year after we entered World War I, there was a less exuberant, but there was still a Midway, and the Midway had acts like Mystic Maddie, the Lady of the Swords, and Johnny the Seal Boy, whomever that was. The 4-H Club back then had exhibits titled Economy for Defense and Linen Substitutes for the War. In 1961, the fair had bounced back with a record attendance of 76,000 people. Still hot, 96 degrees at 3 o'clock. That's what was recorded. And at least one person who was not fazed by the heat was Governor Marvin Mandel. He had been presented with a special Maryland cake that day and a basket of winning vegetables from the state fair, and he won $7.40 on a race, a horse race that was suspiciously called the Governor's Daily Purse. In 2002, one of the star attractions was the Livestock Birthing Center in the fabulous Cow Palace. In that year, a pig named Spot held people's rapt attention for hours until giving birth successfully to a litter of piglets. In 2005, the big attractions, some literally, were the Budweiser Clydesdales, the FBI agent and Watergate figure G. Gordon Liddy, and the rebel rocker Ted Nugent. I guess some things have changed since the beginning days, but maybe not a lot has changed from the beginning days. We can't end this video without talking about food, and there's something about state fairs that makes everybody want to fry everything possible. Not sure what that is. A few years ago, there was a wonderful article in the Baltimore Sun by a journalist, Rob Casper, who was featuring fried corn dogs and fried Oreos, also noting what some other state fairs had. The Florida State Fair fried pickles, of course called frickles, and the Minnesota State Fair, which seems to be the frying state fair capital of America. Folks were frying spaghetti and meatballs, fried pizza, and apparently one stand was attempting to fry a Sloppy Joe sandwich. I guess you got to try it if you're there. I don't know what all of the food is going to be this year, but I'll wrap up by saying this year again, there's a competition called the Mallet, a food competition, and you don't have to be a risky gambler to bet that a good portion of that is going to feature crabs. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.